Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode. Today we are going to be covering the following topics. All the timestamps are in the description below. And I hope you enjoy today's episode. So let's get started on these topics. Let's understand a very vital part that DTO, data transfer objects, play with entity framework and why you definitely need to understand them. So here, when we have a student summary DTO, this is giving us information at summary level from this raw SQL method here. So you can see that the SQL is doing a lot of work, including getting the name of the student and doing a count of how many enrollment the student has by looking at the student subjects table. The student subjects table is not a class or a DB set within our C# application. So here you can see that we have a student class here. We have a summary DTO, and a summary DTO2, and there's a staff feature table, but that's pretty much it. We don't have any other DB set. So here's where DTO plays a very important role. So you can see I have two DTOs here, one which has no number at the end and one with a number 2 at the end. So if you look at our query here, our query is actually quite complex. It's using a table that is not a DB set or class within our application. So this sort of work can only be done with the data transfer object that we created, which is student summary DTO. This is the one without a number at the end. In order for you to do that with the vanilla kind of link way of doing it, that's practically impossible. This is because the student subject isn't a class within our C# application, although it might be a table in the backend. So in this situation, you cannot do this because the subject doesn't exist. So you have to create the subject if you really wanted to make this work, because otherwise entity framework is unable to determine the relationship between this object and the student object that you have in your code. But with raw SQL, you can actually bypass most of that and make all that work happen within this raw SQL, but yet still utilize the entity framework context and set function that Microsoft have built. So going back to the point here, which is if you want to use a student summary DTO, you have to register it, because otherwise entity framework won't be able to pick it up. That's why within the on model creating, you have to use the following line of code to make the data transfer object work. So this is important to understand why you cannot bypass this. What we're trying to do here without creating a DB set for student subject, this is an impossible task. You have to create this. So a way around it is you actually use the from SQL method over here as part of entity framework, and then you are able to use that table, and using the data transfer object which you have registered with entity framework, you are able to create summary level information in your application as a class linked with entity framework. The only thing that you cannot do is update the database back, because of course there's summary level data and we do not want to update it back into the database. So I hope this makes sense and it gives you lots of ideas to explore around what is possible. The important concept to understand is whenever you create a DTO, make sure you register it with entity framework just for the purpose of auto mapping of fields. So what I mean by that is in your DTO, you have a name and enrollment field here or property. When we run this raw SQL over here, so you can see we've got name and enrollment. By registering with entity framework, you're enabling that activity to happen. So the name and the enrollment data that you get from this SQL will automatically get mapped to the fields within the data transfer object. So this is the reason why you register this, but without a key, because we will not be updating the backend database. How do you call a stored procedure with entity framework? So here we are in SQL Server Management Studio, and we have our database here called school, and then we have a table called students. And what we want to do is, rather than directly query the students table, we actually want to use a stored proc or get active students. And all the stored proc does is basically return students where they are active. So is active is equal to 1. This is a very simple stored proc. So what we'll do is we will click on this execute button to create this stored proc, and this stored procedure is now in the database. So in our C# application, you can see we do have a student class, and the properties of this student class match of the table. So what we want to do is we want to actually, rather than manually specifying the active student, so rather than saying it is active equals 1, we actually just want to use the stored proc because somebody have already written that logic for us in the database, and we want that in one single place in the database rather than in our application, that logic to get active students. We will simply call that stored proc, but notice here we're using context. So that's basically the connection to the database, and notice here we're using the students DB set. So this will provide the mapping, necessary mapping of all the fields that will be output by the stored proc over here, and it will map them to the class that we have here, so that we are able to do things such as this, which is loop through the active students and print their names or whatever it is that we want to do. So if I now run this code, then here you can see the output that we got. So we've got two students, Ali and John, and their names are our output here because they are the only active students. So if we go over to our database here, you can see that we have Sarah, who is the student that is not active. So her name is not being displayed in our application because the logic of the stored procedure takes that out. So the SQL statement is written here. So back in our application, you can see it was very easy for us to execute the stored proc by just using the from SQL row method over here and just executing the stored proc by using the exec get active students. And the mapping is taken care of by entity framework to the relevant fields that we have in the database versus what we have in the C# class for the student over here. So let's have a look at an example where we are calling a stored procedure in entity framework that actually takes in a parameter. So here, this stored procedure is called get older students. So it will look for the age as the parameter coming from our application, and it will select older students where the age is greater than or equal to the age being supplied in by our C# application. So if we create this procedure, so we are just going to click on this execute button over here, and the stored proc has been completed successfully. So if we now go over to our C# application, so within C# application, what we'll do is we will declare a variable for the age. So this could be coming from another logic or even from your users of the application. And what we want to do is we want to execute a stored proc using from SQL row, and we want to call the stored procedure name, and then we want to pass in that parameter. This variable here comes from over here, and what we're doing is notice here we are using students and we're using the connection to our database that we set up earlier. So by doing this, the DB set here will automatically map the outputs from the stored procedure. So that's the properties of the students. So ID, name, age, and so on. It will map everything. So then we can do things like look through the older students over here, and then we can print out their name. So if I run this code over here, and you can see we get the output of Sarah and John. So in our database, let's have a look at which of our students were over the age of 21 or greater. So we can see Sarah is 22, John is 21, while Ali was 20. So hence we only got Sarah and John because they are over the age of 21. So this is how we have a stored proc in our database, and that stored proc takes in a parameter, and that parameter is used within our SQL over here. And then just by using entity framework connection and the student DB set, we are able to call the from SQL RAW row method, and we are able to execute the exec command and call the stored proc and pass it a parameter coming from a variable in our C# application. Once we get the output of the stored proc, we can then loop through the results and print the name of the students who are over the age of 21, or using entity framework and stored proc. Here is how you can add a new record using entity framework. So this application is very simple. It is an application to track students. So here we have a student class, and you can see student can have an ID, name, age, city, and is active. We have our DB context class. So this class we've called a school context. It derives from DB context, so it can get a lot of built-in functionality. And then we've got the students CB set, which is the table in the database. Here we have some configuration for our SQL server. Previously, we used SQLite database, but this time we are using a local SQL server with a database of school. We're using a trusted connection. So basically using our Windows login to use the SQL server we have installed. So here we can see our SQL server table, and you can see we currently have 3 students within this table, and we want to add a 4th student over here. So in this instance, so here what we're going to do is we're going to create a new instance of our student class. We are then going to add the properties. So name would be Judy, age 20, city Oslo, and we're going to set Judy's status as active. Then we got 2 options. One which is we can add Judy. So notice here we're using our connection using the students table. So that's the student DB set, and we're going to add a new student, which is an instance of the student class, which has all the relevant properties that our database expects to receive. And then we are going to use the connection save changes. Now this one is the sync version, which is it happens and it may freeze up your user interface. And then we have async version, which doesn't cause any freezing of your application. So what we'll do is we will use the async version. So we have commented out those lines, and now what we are going to do is we're going to run our application. Then our application has finished running. So let's have a check in the database if the new student have been added. So we had 3 students. So if we now just execute this query again, then what we find is we now have 4 students. We can see Julie have been added on with the information that we supplied. Notice here this additional column in the database that is not actually used in our C# application. So it is very easy to add a new record into your database using C#. And you can imagine using this technique to grab data from a user interface and then adding it to your database. You can use the async version of the methods to prevent your application from freezing. So here we're going to add a student called Kumar and age 25 of Lake City. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use the add sync method here and then save changes sync. Once we have the student, we're gonna track the student's ID in this new student variable over here. And then once the student has been added, we are going to look for that student with that ID. Again, we're using the FindAsync method, basically prevents your computer program from freezing. So if there's a delay on the database side, then it won't cause any freezing of your application. Your application will still be responsive, just waiting for a reply back from the database. And then once we found that student, we are going to update the city to Dallas City. So it's the same student that we added over here. We initially added with Lake City, but then we changed the city to Dallas City. And then finally, once we've done that, we will again use the sync method. But after that, we will then delete that student. So we've got that student over here, and we are going to then use the remove method here to remove that student. And again, we are going to sync the changes with the database using async, and finally the student will be deleted. So what we'll do is on our database side, we will create a false delay. So we will run this code over here, and what this will do is it will hold a lock on the table. And when we run our code, you will see that for a while, nothing will happen. So here your program is still responsive. There are no issues. But as soon as we release the lock on the database side, what you'll find is your program has finished running. So as soon as it was able to did execute the relevant code, and we got the output that we wanted. So it created a student with ID 8. That's where it found the student. And then of course, we got the updated the city to Dallas City, and then finally it deleted the student. So you use the async methods to prevent delays with and freezing of your application. So it's very simple. You use the add function to add the student. You use find function to find the student. You use save changes to save changes to a student. So this is where, for example, you update their city, for example, and then to remove a student, you simply use the remove method. So you can see our database never actually saw the Kumar student appearing here. It was for a very brief while that he was added into the database, but he was deleted as soon as our code ran. But he was deleted shortly after, because this is what our entire program does within the main method. Let's understand the difference between FindAsync and FirstOrDefault, and when should you use one versus the other. With the FindAsync method, you can only use the primary key of your table. So in this instance, we have a student table and student ID is the primary key. So that's why in here, you have to supply an ID field. You can also supply a number. So you can supply, for example, look for the student with the 5th ID. So this is important to understand. So if we have a look at our database, so this is our database. And as you can see, we have an ID column here, and you can see this ID column is the primary key, and these are the values that it contains. So you can only search by this column over here. So you cannot do this. For example, if we do like search by the name of the student. So here, basically we've added a new student, and what we want to do is once we have that new student in this variable, we're just calling the name. So you can see there are no errors in the VS Code editor, But if I try and run this program, what you will see is you'll get this error message. Now, in order to understand this, let's have a look at this error message. So you can see the student was created with ID 12. But when we try and search for that student, it says the key value at position 0 of the call to dbset student find was of type string, which does not match property type of int. So here, this is important, that what it's doing is you over here have supplied it a string, but what it's trying to map against is of type int. It's looking for the primary key. It's looking for the key value at position 0. So that's why your code doesn't work. But if you change this to ID, then your code will work. So if I run this again, you can see we do not get any errors and the code works as expected. But what if you do need to search by anything other than ID? In that instance, this is where the FirstOrDefault method comes in handy. And you can basically use a lambda expression. So we'll just call this S. You can call it wherever you want. And then you can use the lambda operator. Name field is what is the field we want to compare against. So here you notice you didn't have to supply which field you want to compare against, but over here you are specifying, and we're saying that the name field must equal the student name. So this is what we want. So you can't do this sort of stuff over here because it's always comparing against the ID column, while with FirstOrDefault, it actually gives you the option to you decide over here in this lambda expression which column you want to compare against. So I wouldn't worry too much about this lambda operator. I wouldn't worry too much in understanding this lambda operator. All you need to do is you just put letter here and the field name that you want and what do they need to equal to, and by using the FirstOrDefault, and that lets you search by any field that you want. So I hope you understand why you need FindAsync versus FirstOrDefault method over here, and what's the purpose of each of these methods. Updating a record with Entity Framework is very easy. So what you need to do is you need to search for the record that you want to update. So you need to use the context class. So here, what you might be thinking, what is context? So context is our variable over here. So you can see we are declaring a variable new context, and this is basically a class. So if we have a look at the school context class, this basically is deriving from or inheriting from the DB context, and this provides all your connections and so on to the backend SQL Server database. So here, that's our connection to the database. You can see I'm using a local database on a local server, and what you need to do is here we've got the FirstOrDefault option. So we are searching the students table for the first record where the name is John, and what we want to do is once we found John, we just want to print out his details and current city, and then we are going to update John's city to Dallas City. So here we are checking if the record has been found. If it's not equal to null, then yes, record has been found. So we will then make a change to John's city because John is now stored in the student variable. So that's where the results get stored. And we are going to then update the database by using our connection class, which is the context class variable that we defined earlier. So this one is over here. So you can see context, that's just referring to this class. So that's where our connection is. So once that connection has been established, we would use the save changes async method. And this is where the magic of Entity Framework comes in. It will do whatever it needs to do to track the changes of your data and then save them back down into the database. So let's run this. Before we run this, let's have a look at the database. So you can see John is actually, his city is London, and we want to update that over here to Dallas City. So we will run this code over here, and you can see in the terminal output, we have found John over here. So you can see found John and his city in London. And then we are going to update his city to Dallas City. So if we have a look at John, you can see his city has been updated to Dallas City, whereas previously it was London. It is super simple to delete a record in Entity Framework. So here, what we're doing is we are looking for a student called John. So you can see John's name here. We're comparing against the name field in the backend table. We are using the FirstOrDefault method here to find John, and once we found him, we store him in this variable. And then I've just got a Rapunzel write line here, which will basically print John's name and city. And this will let us confirm that it is John that we are looking at, the John that we want to delete. And once we have that, we are going to check that John has definitely been found. So it hasn't returned null, for example. And then we are going to remove John. So to remove him, you basically call the context, the student's table, and you call the remove method, pass it the student that we found. So this student over here, that's basically what we found, which is stored in that variable. We just pass it over here and then leave the rest to entity framework, because it's entity framework job to go and match the relevant student that it's found. So it knows its primary key and so on. So you don't need to worry about that. And then you simply, in order to commit those changes to your database, you call this method on the context class, and once that is done, then your student is deleted. So let's have a look at our database. So this is SQL Server, and we're using SQL Server Management Studio here. So here we have John. So you can see John, age, then city. His ID number is 28 in the database. So we want to get rid of John. Now, entity framework application, we search for John. Once we find him, we print his details, and then we simply pass him to the remove method. So what we pass within here is this variable. So if I run this code here, so you can see we found John and then we deleted the student. So if we didn't call the save changes method, your changes would not be committed to the database. In this instance, we did. So if we go back over to our database, so here we are back in our database, and if you can see John was dead, but if I refresh this over here, okay, and now that it's been refreshed, you can see John has disappeared from our list. So it is very simple to delete a student. It's basically a two-step process. Find the student, use the first or default method, look for whatever criteria you want to match against. Ask the user, do they want to delete this John? If they do, run your code over here, pass John to the remove method, and then simply save changes back to the database by calling this method. An entity framework will take care of the rest for you. So now let's explore this database model over here. So we've got students, and then we have courses, and those students enroll onto courses. So we have another table called enrollments. If I now expand the student table, to keep it simple, we have only included student ID and the student name. And if we look at the courses, you can see it's just course ID and the course title. And for enrollments, all we have is the enrollment ID, the student ID, and the course ID. Notice that these are the primary keys over here. For courses, of course, the course ID is the primary key. For students, is the student ID, that's the primary key. So how do you work with this model where you have a relationship with one student can be enrolled onto multiple courses, and one course would have many students enrolled onto it? So how do you work this data with the entity framework? It's actually very simple. So let's have a look at our classes. So here you can see we have a student class. We've got the two fields, student ID and name. Then we have course, and we have the course ID and the title. Then we have enrollment, and we have the enrollment ID, student ID, and the course ID. Now, in order for this to work with entity framework, what you have to do is each student can have multiple enrollments. So what you do is you declare another property in here to define that relationship. So here we're using I collection, and the collection is going to be of type enrollment. Now, notice what enrollment is. Enrollment is this class that we have created. It's got the enrollment ID, student ID, course ID. So that lives within the student class. So basically think of it as like a list of courses that the student is enrolled into. So it's a one-to-many relationship. Then you have the courses. So here you've got the course selection. So again, here one course can have many students enrolled into it. So again, you say this is a list of enrollments this course is involved in. And then within the enrollment class, what you have is each enrollment could have a student. So one enrollment can only have one student, and it can have one course, because here you've got the enrollment ID and you've got the student ID and the course ID. So you can see why we have a collection here versus not a collection here, because this isn't one-to-many relationship. This is that actually for each enrollment there can only be one student and one course. They cannot have duplicate enrollment ID. So this is the basic structure to set up your entity framework application. And then you can do stuff like this, which we will talk about at another time, but I'll run this so you can see what's going on. So here for John, we are picking out what courses is he enrolled into, and you can see John is enrolled into English literature and computer science. Keep watching and we'll discuss more around this.